Picture this. You're waking up before dawn, not to the gentle chirping of birds or the soft glow of sunrise, but to the harsh reality that today, like every day for the past 400 years of your family's existence, you will work someone else's land, pay taxes to someone else's government, and pray that this year's harvest doesn't fail, because if it does, you might not survive the winter. You are a peasant in the Ottoman Empire, and your life is about to get a whole lot worse than you ever imagined. Welcome back to the channel. Before we dive into one of history's most brutal examples of why being born into the wrong social class could literally be a death sentence, smash that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Today, we're exploring the harsh reality of peasant life in one of history's most powerful empires. And trust me, by the end of this video, you'll be grateful you were born in the 21st century. The Ottoman Empire, spanning over 600 years from 1299 to 1922, is often remembered for its magnificent palaces, powerful sultans, and impressive military conquests. We think of Suleiman the Magnificent, the stunning architecture of the Blue Mosque, and the empire's control over crucial trade routes between Europe and Asia. But here's what the history books often gloss over. This empire's grandeur was built quite literally on the backs of millions of peasants who lived lives of unimaginable hardship. When we talk about the Ottoman Empire, we're discussing a realm that at its peak controlled territory spanning 3 continents. From the gates of Vienna in the north to Yemen in the south, from Algeria in the west to the borders of Iran in the east. This massive empire encompassed modern-day Turkey, much of the Balkans, large portions of the Middle East, and significant parts of North Africa. And throughout this vast territory, the story was the same: a tiny elite living in luxury, while the overwhelming majority of the population, the peasants, existed in conditions that would make a medieval serf weep with envy. But why focus on the peasants? Simple, they made up roughly 85 to 90% of the Ottoman population. These weren't just farmers, they were the foundation upon which the entire empire rested. They produced the food that fed the cities, provided the taxes that funded the government, supplied the soldiers for the military, and created the wealth that allowed the Ottoman elite to live in splendor. Yet their reward for this essential contribution was a life of grinding poverty, constant fear, and systematic oppression that lasted for centuries. To understand why peasant life in the Ottoman Empire was so brutal, we need to start with the Timar system, the foundation of Ottoman rural administration and the source of peasant misery for hundreds of years. The Timar system was essentially the Ottoman version of feudalism, but with some distinctly Ottoman twists that made it even worse for the common people. Under this system, the Sultan theoretically owned all land in the empire. He would then grant portions of this land, called Timars, to cavalry officers known as Sipahis in exchange for military service. These Sipahis were essentially military landlords who had the right to collect taxes from the peasants living on their assigned lands. Now you might think, well, that doesn't sound so different from European feudalism. But here's where it gets worse. Unlike European serfs who at least had some traditional rights and protections under feudal law, Ottoman peasants existed in a legal grey area where their protections were minimal and largely theoretical. The Sipahi had the right to collect not just a portion of the peasants' harvest, but also various other taxes and fees. There was the ushur, a tithe of typically 10% of the agricultural produce, but this was just the beginning. Peasants also paid the riesemi sift, a tax on their plough animals, the riesemi dönüm, a tax based on the amount of land they cultivated, and numerous other fees for everything from getting married to burying their dead. But here's the truly insidious part. The amount of these taxes wasn't fixed. The Sipahi had considerable discretion in determining how much the peasants owed, and since there was no effective oversight of these rural areas, abuse was rampant. A Sipahi could decide that this year the peasants needed to pay 15% instead of 10%, or that a new road maintenance fee was suddenly required, and the peasants had virtually no recourse. The peasants were also subject to corvée labor, forced unpaid work for their Sipahi. This could involve anything from maintaining the Sipahi's residence to working on public projects like road construction or bridge repair. During harvest season, when every hour of daylight was precious for gathering crops before winter, peasants might be forced to spend days working on their lord's personal projects instead of securing their own family's survival. What made this system particularly cruel was its unpredictability. A European serf might face harsh conditions, but those conditions were generally consistent and governed by tradition. An Ottoman peasant never knew when their Sipahi might decide to impose new taxes, demand additional labor, or simply take what he wanted by force. This constant uncertainty created a climate of fear that permeated every aspect of peasant life. The Timar system also created a vicious cycle of debt and dependence. Poor harvests, unexpected tax demands, or family emergencies could force peasants to borrow money or grain from their Sipahi or from urban moneylenders. The interest rates on these loans were often astronomical, and peasants could find themselves trapped in cycles of debt that lasted generations. A bad harvest year could condemn not just a peasant, but his children and grandchildren to lives of indentured servitude. If the Timar system was the foundation of peasant oppression, taxation was the mechanism that made their lives truly unbearable. The Ottoman tax system was a labyrinthine nightmare that seemed designed to extract every possible coin from the peasant population while providing them with as little as possible in return. Let's start with the basic agricultural taxes. The osher or tithe was supposed to be 10% of agricultural production, but in practice it was often much higher. Tax collectors had wide discretion in assessing the value of crops, and they regularly overestimated yields or undervalued the quality of peasant produce to justify higher tax bills. Peasants who protested these assessments faced harassment, imprisonment, or worse. Then there was the sizzi, a poll tax levied on non-Muslim subjects of the empire. This tax was explicitly designed to encourage conversion to Islam, but it also served as a significant source of revenue. The sizzi varied based on the perceived wealth of the individual, but tax collectors often arbitrarily assigned peasants to higher tax brackets regardless of their actual financial situation. Christian and Jewish peasants thus faced an additional layer of taxation that their Muslim neighbors didn't have to endure. The resmi sift was a tax on draft animals, oxen, horses, or mules used for plowing. For a peasant family, these animals were often their most valuable possessions and absolutely essential for survival. Losing a draft animal could mean the difference between life and death, yet the tax on these animals was substantial. Worse, the tax was assessed annually regardless of whether the animal was healthy, productive, or even still alive. A peasant whose ox died of disease still owed the full tax on that animal for the rest of the tax year. Beyond these regular taxes, there were countless extraordinary levies that could be imposed at any time. When the empire went to war, which was frequently, special military taxes were imposed on rural communities. The peasants, who were least able to afford it and least likely to benefit from military victories, were expected to fund the very campaigns that often resulted in their sons being conscripted as soldiers. The avarice taxes were among the most hated of these extraordinary levies. Originally intended as emergency taxes during times of crisis, the avarice became increasingly regular as the Ottoman government's financial needs grew. These taxes could be imposed for almost any reason: military campaigns, palace construction, natural disasters, or simply because the treasury was running low. The amounts were unpredictable and could be devastating to peasant families who were already living at subsistence level. Perhaps most frustrating for peasants was the bedeli nuzul, a tax that was supposed to provide provisions for the army but was often collected in cash instead. This meant peasants were paying money that was theoretically being used to buy food for soldiers, food that the peasants themselves were also required to provide directly through other taxes and requisitions. They were, in effect, being taxed twice for the same military supplies. The tax collection process itself was often brutal. Tax collectors, known as multezims, were frequently corrupt officials who saw their positions as opportunities for personal enrichment. They would arrive in villages with armed escorts and demand immediate payment of taxes, often refusing to accept the actual amount owed and instead demanding bribes or additional payments. Peasants who couldn't pay immediately faced having their crops, animals, or tools confiscated. In extreme cases, they might be imprisoned or physically beaten until they or their families could produce the required funds. The timing of tax collection was particularly cruel. Taxes were often demanded during the spring, before the harvest, when peasant families were at their most vulnerable. This forced peasants to sell their seed grain or borrow money at usurious rates just to pay their tax bills, setting them up for failure in the coming growing season. What made this system even more oppressive was its regressive nature. While wealthy merchants and urban elites had various ways to avoid or minimize their tax burdens through connections, bribes, or legal loopholes, peasants had no such options. They paid the highest effective tax rates of any group in Ottoman society, while receiving the fewest benefits from government spending. Among all the horrors faced by Ottoman peasants, perhaps none was more psychologically devastating than the devshirme system, the periodic collection of Christian boys to serve in the Ottoman military and administration. This practice, which continued from the 14th to the 17th centuries, represents one of the most systematic and traumatic forms of human exploitation in history. The devshirme, which literally means collecting or gathering, was conducted every 3 to 7 years in Christian regions of the empire. Ottoman officials would travel through villages, examining boys between the ages of 8 and 20, selecting the strongest, most intelligent, and most promising candidates for forced conversion to Islam and lifelong service to the Sultan. For peasant families, the approach of devshirme collectors was like the arrival of the Grim Reaper himself. Mothers would hide their sons, families would flee to the mountains, and entire communities would be thrown into panic. But resistance was futile and dangerous. Villages that attempted to hide their boys or resist the collection faced severe punishment, including increased taxation, military occupation, or brutal reprisals against the entire community. The selection process was deliberately traumatic. Boys were examined like livestock, their physical strength tested, their intelligence assessed, their family backgrounds investigated. Those deemed suitable were immediately separated from their families, often with no opportunity for goodbyes. Parents were forced to watch as their children were led away in chains, knowing they would likely never see them again. The chosen boys were then marched to Istanbul, often on foot over hundreds of miles. Many didn't survive the journey. Those who did were forcibly converted to Islam, given new Turkish names, and began years of intensive training, either as janissaries, elite soldiers, or as palace administrators. They were forbidden from contacting their families or returning to their birthplaces. In the eyes of the Ottoman state, their previous lives had been completely erased. From the Ottoman perspective, the devshirme was a sophisticated system for creating loyal administrators and soldiers. Boys taken at a young age could be thoroughly indoctrinated and would have no divided loyalties to family or homeland. Many devshirme recruits rose to high positions in the Ottoman government and military, with some even becoming grand viziers, the most powerful officials in the empire after the Sultan himself. But for peasant families, the devshirme was nothing short of legalized kidnapping. It represented the ultimate expression of their powerlessness under Ottoman rule. Not only were they taxed into poverty and forced to work someone else's land, but the state could literally take their children whenever it pleased. The psychological trauma of this system extended far beyond the families directly affected. Every Christian peasant family lived with the constant fear that their sons might be chosen, and this fear poisoned family relationships and community bonds. The devshirme also had devastating demographic effects on Christian peasant communities. By systematically removing the most promising young men from rural areas, the system weakened these communities' ability to develop local leadership, maintain their cultural traditions, and improve their economic conditions. It was, in effect, a form of cultural genocide that gradually weakened Christian communities throughout the empire. Parents developed desperate strategies to protect their sons. Some deliberately malnourished their boys to make them appear weak and unsuitable. Others arranged early marriages for their sons, as married boys were sometimes exempted from collection. Some families went into debt to bribe Ottoman officials to overlook their children. But these strategies were unreliable and often backfired, resulting in punishment for the entire family. The system was also deeply arbitrary and corrupt. While there were supposed to be rules about which boys could be taken, only sons were sometimes exempted. Certain occupations might provide protection. Some regions had traditional immunities. These rules were inconsistently applied. Ottoman officials could ignore exemptions if they were offered sufficient bribes, or they might take boys who should have been protected if their families couldn't afford to buy immunity. Perhaps most tragically, the devshirme created impossible moral dilemmas for peasant families. Should they be proud that their son had been chosen for a life that might lead to wealth and power? Or should they mourn him as dead? Should they maintain hope that he might someday return? Or should they try to forget he ever existed? These psychological torments were yet another burden placed on families that were already struggling to survive. While the Ottoman Empire is often praised by modern historians for its relative religious tolerance compared to contemporary European states, this tolerance came at a steep price for non-Muslim peasants. The reality of religious life for Christian and Jewish peasants was one of systematic discrimination, economic exploitation, and constant pressure to convert to Islam. The foundation of Ottoman religious policy was the millet system, which granted limited autonomy to religious communities while keeping them firmly subordinated to Muslim authority. While this system allowed Christians and Jews to maintain their religious practices and communal institutions, it also codified their second-class status and made them easy targets for exploitation. The most obvious burden was the sizzi, the poll tax on non-Muslims we discussed earlier. But the sizzi was just the beginning of the financial penalties for maintaining one's faith. Non-Muslims faced higher tax rates on virtually everything: land, trade, inheritance, and even marriage ceremonies. They were required to pay special fees to build or repair their places of worship, and these permissions were often arbitrarily denied or delayed. The legal system also discriminated heavily against non-Muslims. In Islamic courts, which handled most legal matters, the testimony of Christians and Jews was given less weight than that of Muslims. This meant that in disputes between peasants of different faiths, the Muslim peasant had a significant advantage, regardless of the facts of the case. Non-Muslim peasants found it nearly impossible to get justice when wronged by Muslim officials, landlords, or neighbors. Building restrictions were particularly onerous. Christian churches and Jewish synagogues couldn't be built higher than Muslim mosques in the same area. They couldn't have bells or other ostentatious features that might offend Muslim sensibilities. Repair work on religious buildings required special permits that were expensive and often denied. Many Christian communities were forced to let their churches decay rather than navigate the bureaucratic nightmare and expense of getting repair permits. The dress codes imposed on non-Muslims were designed to mark them as inferior and make them targets for harassment. Christians were required to wear dark colors and specific types of hats or clothing that immediately identified their religious status. Jews faced similar restrictions, often being required to wear yellow clothing or distinctive headgear. These dress codes weren't just about religious identification, they were about humiliation and social control. Perhaps most insidiously, the Ottoman system created powerful incentives for conversion to Islam while making the process of conversion irreversible and traumatic for communities. Muslims enjoyed significant tax advantages, better legal status, and access to government positions. For desperately poor peasant families, conversion could mean the difference between survival and starvation. But conversion wasn't a simple personal choice. It was a community catastrophe. When the head of a peasant household converted to Islam, it often meant the loss of community support systems, the breaking of family ties, and the abandonment of cultural traditions that had sustained these communities for centuries. Children of converts were raised as Muslims and were often hostile to their Christian or Jewish relatives, creating permanent rifts in extended families. The conversion process itself was designed to be traumatic and irreversible. New converts were required to publicly renounce their former faith, often in ceremonies designed to humiliate their former co-religionists. They were given new Muslim names and were expected to demonstrate their commitment to Islam by reporting on the activities of their former communities. Many new converts became some of the harshest oppressors of their former neighbors, either out of genuine religious conviction or as a way to prove their loyalty to their new faith. Local Ottoman officials often put additional pressure on non-Muslim communities through arbitrary harassment and persecution. Churches might be closed on trumped-up charges. Religious festivals might be banned or restricted. Community leaders might be imprisoned or fined for imaginary offenses. This constant low-level persecution was designed to make life so difficult for non-Muslim communities that conversion would seem like the only rational choice. The result was a steady demographic shift throughout Ottoman territories. Christian and Jewish communities that had existed for centuries gradually shrank as families converted to Islam, emigrated, or simply died out under the pressure of systematic discrimination. This wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate policy designed to gradually Islamize the empire's population while maintaining the fiction of religious tolerance. For those who maintained their faith despite these pressures, life was a constant struggle, not just for physical survival, but for cultural and religious preservation. Community leaders had to navigate complex relationships with Ottoman authorities while trying to protect their people from the worst abuses. Parents had to decide whether to hide their children's intelligence and abilities to protect them from the devshirme. even if it meant limiting their opportunities in life. If the man-made oppression of the Ottoman system wasn't enough, peasants also had to contend with natural disasters that were made infinitely worse by government indifference and incompetence. The Ottoman Empire experienced regular famines, plagues, earthquakes, and other natural catastrophes, and in each case, the government's response prioritized the needs of the elite while leaving peasants to suffer and die. The most devastating of these disasters were the recurring famines that swept through different regions of the empire. These famines were often caused by combinations of factors: drought, floods, locusts, plant diseases, or simply the disruption of agricultural cycles by warfare. But what turned manageable food shortages into mass starvation events was the Ottoman government's agricultural and trade policies. The empire operated extensive grain requisition systems that were supposed to ensure adequate food supplies for major cities and military units. In theory, these systems included provisions for emergency grain reserves and distribution during times of shortage. In practice, they were mechanisms for extracting as much grain as possible from rural areas regardless of local conditions. When harvests failed in a particular region, Ottoman officials still demanded their usual grain requisitions. Peasants who couldn't meet these demands faced imprisonment, confiscation of their remaining property, or violent reprisals. Local officials, whose careers depended on meeting their quotas, often chose to extract grain from starving rural communities rather than report shortfalls to their superiors. The empire's trade policies made these famines worse by encouraging grain exports even during times of shortage. Merchants could make enormous profits by shipping grain from famine-stricken areas to cities where prices were higher, and Ottoman officials were often bribed to allow these exports despite local starvation. Peasants literally starved to death while watching their region's grain being loaded onto ships bound for Istanbul or other major cities. The government's response to famine was typically too little, too late, and focused primarily on preventing urban unrest rather than saving rural lives. When food riots broke out in major cities, the government might temporarily ban grain exports or open emergency food distributions. But these measures rarely reached rural areas, where the majority of famine victims lived and died in anonymity. Disease outbreaks were equally devastating and were handled with similar callousness. The Ottoman Empire experienced regular plague outbreaks, including several major pandemics that killed hundreds of thousands of people. The government's response was typically to quarantine affected areas and prevent the spread of disease to major cities, with little regard for treating the sick or providing aid to affected communities. Quarantine measures were particularly brutal for peasant communities. When plague broke out in a rural area, Ottoman officials would often surround entire villages with armed guards and prevent anyone from entering or leaving. This prevented the spread of disease, but also cut off affected communities from food supplies, medical aid, and any possibility of escape. Villages under quarantine often experienced mortality rates of 50% or higher, with entire families dying not just from disease, but from starvation and neglect. The medical resources available to peasants during disease outbreaks were virtually non-existent. The empire had sophisticated medical traditions and skilled physicians, but these were concentrated in major cities and served primarily wealthy urban populations. Rural peasants relied on folk remedies, local healers of varying competence, and prayer. When these failed, they simply died. Earthquakes and other natural disasters revealed the same pattern of elite privilege and peasant abandonment. When the 1509 earthquake devastated Istanbul, the government mobilized massive resources for reconstruction. bringing in craftsmen and materials from across the empire. When earthquakes struck rural areas, peasants were left to rebuild their homes and communities with no outside assistance whatsoever. The 1648 earthquake in Anatolia destroyed hundreds of villages and left tens of thousands of peasants homeless. The government's response was to increase tax collection in the affected areas to make up for lost revenue, forcing earthquake survivors to pay higher taxes while living in ruins. Many peasant families were driven to permanent poverty or forced migration by the combination of natural disaster and government exploitation. Flooding was another recurring disaster that revealed the government's priorities. The empire invested heavily in flood control measures for major cities and important agricultural areas that served urban markets. But rural areas that primarily fed their own populations received no such protection. When floods destroyed peasant villages, the government's main concern was ensuring that tax collection resumed as quickly as possible. The Ottoman government did have some institutions theoretically designed to provide disaster relief. The pious foundations, vakıf, were supposed to maintain emergency food supplies and provide aid during times of crisis. But these foundations were often mismanaged, their resources diverted to other purposes, or their aid restricted to urban areas where their activities would be more visible to potential donors. Perhaps most tragically, the government often made natural disasters worse through its own policies. Military campaigns during harvest seasons could leave fields unharvested, creating artificial famines. Forced population movements could disrupt established agricultural systems and leave entire regions vulnerable to food shortages. The constant demand for taxes and grain requisitions meant that peasant communities had no reserves to fall back on when disasters struck. In addition to all the official forms of oppression they faced, Ottoman peasants also had to contend with endemic violence from bandits, irregular soldiers, and corrupt officials. The empire's vast frontiers and weak rural administration created perfect conditions for various forms of organized crime that specifically targeted the most vulnerable populations. The most notorious of these criminal groups were the Salali rebels, irregular troops who had originally served in Ottoman military campaigns, but who turned to banditry when they were no longer needed or paid by the government. These groups, sometimes numbering in the thousands, roamed the Anatolian countryside for decades, essentially functioning as roving armies that lived off the systematic plunder of peasant communities. The Celali rebellions of the late 16th and early 17th centuries were particularly devastating for rural populations. These weren't romantic Robin Hood-style bandits who stole from the rich to give to the poor. They were professional military units that had turned to organized crime as a career. They possessed military-grade weapons and training, and they used both to terrorize peasant villages into submission. A typical Salali raid on a peasant village followed a predictable pattern. The bandits would surround the village before dawn, preventing escape, and then systematically loot everything of value. Grain stores would be emptied, livestock would be driven off, and any peasants who resisted would be killed as examples to the others. Women and children might be kidnapped and sold into slavery. The bandits would often torture village leaders to force them to reveal the locations of hidden valuables or food supplies. What made these attacks particularly devastating was their systematic nature. Unlike random criminal acts, Salali raids were calculated economic enterprises. The bandits understood rural economies and knew exactly how much they could steal without completely destroying their victims' ability to produce wealth for future raids. They were essentially parasites who had learned to exploit peasant communities sustainably. keeping their victims alive and productive so they could be robbed again later. The government's response to Salali banditry reveals its priorities clearly. When bandits threatened major trade routes or important cities, the government would mount major military campaigns to suppress them. But when the same bandits focused their activities on isolated rural communities, official response was minimal or non-existent. The government seemed to view Salali raids on peasants as an acceptable price to pay for keeping these dangerous irregular forces away from more important targets. In some cases, the government actually made deals with Salali leaders, offering them official positions or payments in exchange for directing their activities away from government interests. This meant that peasants were essentially being sacrificed to buy peace for urban areas and commercial interests. The government was willing to let bandits systematically terrorize rural populations as long as they didn't interfere with more important economic and political activities. Local officials were often part of the problem rather than the solution. Corrupt governors, judges, and military commanders frequently had financial relationships with bandit groups. They might provide information about which villages were worth raiding, or they might take cuts of the profits from bandit activities. Some officials were bandits themselves, using their government positions to legitimize their criminal enterprises. The justice system provided no meaningful protection for peasant victims of violence. Islamic law theoretically provided strong protections for life and property, but these protections were meaningless if they couldn't be enforced. Rural courts were often corrupt, understaffed, or simply absent. Peasants who tried to seek justice for crimes committed against them faced long journeys to distant courts, expensive legal fees, and judges who were often bribed by or allied with the very criminals they were supposed to prosecute. Even when peasants managed to obtain legal judgments against their attackers, enforcement was nearly impossible. A court might rule that bandits owed compensation to their victims, but if the bandits were still armed and organized while the peasants were scattered and defenseless, such judgments were worthless pieces of paper. Many peasants learned that seeking justice was not only futile but dangerous, as it might mark them for retaliation. The absence of effective law enforcement created a climate of permanent fear in rural areas. Peasants couldn't plan for the future because they never knew when bandits might destroy everything they had built. They couldn't invest in improving their farms or homes because such improvements might attract unwanted attention from criminals. They couldn't travel safely to markets or visit relatives in neighboring villages because the roads were controlled by various criminal groups. This climate of violence had profound psychological effects on peasant communities. Chronic fear and stress took tolls on physical and mental health. Social institutions broke down as communities became focused on mere survival rather than mutual support and cultural development. Trust eroded as people suspected their neighbors of collaborating with bandits or officials. The most tragic aspect of this situation was how it created cycles of violence and desperation. Peasants who lost everything to bandit raids might turn to banditry themselves, having no other way to survive. Young men who saw no future in agriculture might join criminal groups as their only path to economic advancement. Communities that were victimized by violence sometimes turned to vigilante justice, creating new cycles of conflict and revenge. The Ottoman military machine that conquered vast territories and struck fear into the hearts of European monarchs was fueled by the blood of peasant soldiers who had no choice in their fate and little chance of survival. The empire's conscription systems were designed to extract maximum military manpower from rural populations while providing minimal compensation or protection for the soldiers and their families. The most systematic form of military conscription was the Devshirme system we discussed earlier. But this only affected Christian boys. Muslim peasants faced their own forms of forced military service that were equally devastating to rural communities. The most common was the churchy system, which required each village to provide a certain number of soldiers for military campaigns. When war broke out, which was frequently in the Ottoman Empire, officials would arrive in villages with quotas to fill. Each community was expected to provide a specific number of able-bodied men, and village leaders were held personally responsible for meeting these quotas. The selection process was often corrupt and arbitrary, with wealthy families able to buy exemptions for their sons, while poor families had no protection. The conscription process was traumatic for peasant families. Unlike modern military service with defined terms and regular communication with home, Ottoman military service was often indefinite and frequently fatal. Peasant soldiers might be sent to campaigns hundreds or thousands of miles from home, in climates and territories they had never experienced. Communication with families was virtually impossible, and many soldiers simply disappeared without their families ever learning their fate. The mortality rates for peasant soldiers were horrific. Military medicine was primitive, food supplies were often inadequate, and battle casualties were enormous. Disease killed far more soldiers than enemy action, and peasant troops received minimal medical care when they fell ill. A peasant conscripted for a major campaign had perhaps a 30 to 40% chance of ever returning home. And those who did return were often disabled by wounds or disease. The economic impact of conscription on peasant families was catastrophic. When the primary breadwinner was taken away for military service, families often faced immediate starvation. The timing of conscription was particularly cruel. Men were often taken during planting or harvest seasons, when their labor was most desperately needed. This created artificial famines in rural areas that had lost too many workers to military service. Families of conscripted soldiers received no compensation from the government for their loss. Unlike later military systems that provided pay or pensions for soldiers and their dependents, Ottoman peasant conscripts were essentially slaves who were expected to serve without compensation. Their families were left to survive as best they could, often slipping into permanent poverty or being forced to abandon their land. The military training provided to peasant conscripts was minimal and focused on immediate battlefield utility rather than long-term soldier development. Most were given basic weapons training and thrown into combat with experienced units. Their primary value was as expendable infantry who could absorb enemy fire and engage in the brutal close-quarters combat that characterized Ottoman military tactics. Peasant soldiers were typically equipped with inferior weapons and armor compared to elite units like the Janissaries. They might be given simple spears, basic swords, or outdated firearms, while professional soldiers received the best available military technology. This disparity in equipment reflected their expendable status and virtually guaranteed higher casualty rates among peasant troops. The logistics of supporting peasant armies were deliberately minimal. Professional military units had established supply chains and administrative support, but peasant conscripts were often expected to supply themselves or live off the land. This meant that peasant soldiers were frequently hungry, poorly clothed, and inadequately sheltered, making them more susceptible to disease and less effective in combat. Discipline in peasant military units was maintained through brutal punishment and the constant threat of execution. Desertion was punishable by death, but so were many other offenses including cowardice, insubordination, or even complaining about conditions. Military commanders had absolute authority over their peasant soldiers and could order executions for virtually any reason. The psychological trauma of military service was compounded by the cultural and linguistic diversity of Ottoman armies. Peasant conscripts might find themselves serving alongside men who spoke different languages, followed different customs, and came from entirely different regions of the empire. This isolation made military service even more traumatic and reduced unit cohesion, making these forces less effective in combat. Perhaps most tragically, successful military service rarely led to meaningful advancement for peasant soldiers. While some exceptional individuals might rise through the ranks, the vast majority of peasant conscripts who survived their service returned home to the same poverty and oppression they had left. Their military experience provided no transferable skills for civilian life, and they often found that their families and communities had been devastated by their absence. The Ottoman economic system was designed to extract wealth from rural producers while providing them with minimal opportunities for advancement or prosperity. Peasant families could work for generations without ever improving their economic situation, trapped in cycles of debt and dependency that made economic mobility virtually impossible. The foundation of this economic oppression was the system of land tenure that prevented peasants from owning property. Since all land theoretically belonged to the Sultan, peasants were essentially tenant farmers who could never build wealth through property ownership. They invested their labor in improving land they could never own, with all the benefits of their improvements ultimately flowing to their feudal overlords. This system created powerful disincentives for agricultural improvement. Why would a peasant invest in better irrigation, soil improvement, or more productive crops when any benefits would be captured by the Sipahi or the state through higher taxes? The lack of secure property rights meant that Ottoman agriculture remained technologically backward compared to other regions where farmers had stronger incentives to innovate. The credit systems available to peasants were designed to trap them in permanent debt, rather than provide opportunities for economic advancement. When peasants needed money for seed, tools, or family emergencies, they typically had to borrow from the same Sipahis who collected their taxes or from urban moneylenders who charged usurious interest rates. These loans were often structured to be impossible to repay. Interest rates of 50 to 100% annually were common, and the loans were typically secured by the peasants' future harvests. A bad harvest year could leave a peasant family indebted for generations, with all their production going to service old debts rather than improving their living conditions. The marketing systems for agricultural products were designed to minimize peasant profits while maximizing the wealth of urban merchants and government officials. Peasants were often forced to sell their crops to designated buyers at below-market prices, or they had to pay substantial fees and bribes to access urban markets where they might get better prices. Transportation costs ate up much of whatever profit peasants might have made from their crops. The empire's road system was designed for military movement rather than commercial transport, and peasants had to pay numerous tolls and fees to move their goods to market. By the time they reached urban markets, the combination of transportation costs and various fees often meant they were selling at a loss. The guild system in cities was designed to prevent rural producers from competing with established urban craftsmen and merchants. Peasants were prohibited from engaging in most non-agricultural economic activities, limiting their opportunities for supplemental income during slow agricultural seasons. This forced specialization kept peasants dependent on agriculture even when other economic activities might have been more profitable. Government price controls were typically designed to benefit urban consumers at the expense of rural producers. When food prices rose in cities, the government might impose price ceilings that forced peasants to sell below cost rather than allow urban populations to pay market prices for food. These controls were never applied in reverse. When the prices of manufactured goods or tools that peasants needed increased, they were forced to pay whatever the market demanded. The monetary system itself worked against peasants. The empire used various currencies and frequently debased its coins to fund government expenses. Peasants, who often stored what little wealth they had in coin, saw their savings eroded by inflation and debasement. Meanwhile, their tax obligations were often calculated in fixed amounts that didn't decrease when the currency was devalued, meaning they effectively faced higher tax rates during periods of monetary instability. Access to new technologies and improved techniques was restricted by both economic and social barriers. Agricultural innovations were often developed in urban centers or imported from other regions, but the costs of adopting new methods were typically beyond peasant means. Even when better seeds, tools, or techniques were available, peasants couldn't afford to risk experimenting with methods that might fail and doom their families to starvation. The absence of banking and financial services in rural areas meant that peasants had no safe places to store money or mechanisms for making large purchases. This forced them to rely on informal credit networks that were often exploitative, or to keep their modest savings in forms that were vulnerable to theft, fire, or other disasters. Trade restrictions prevented peasants from developing direct relationships with distant markets that might offer better prices for their products. Most agricultural trade was controlled by urban merchants who acted as intermediaries, taking substantial profits while adding little value. Peasants were price takers who had to accept whatever terms were offered by these merchant networks. Beyond the physical hardships and economic exploitation, Ottoman peasants faced systematic social humiliation designed to reinforce their inferior status and prevent the development of autonomous peasant culture. The Ottoman social hierarchy was rigid and explicitly designed to keep peasants in permanent subordination to urban elites and government officials. The legal system codified peasant inferiority in numerous ways. Peasants could not testify against members of higher social classes in court proceedings. Their word was considered inherently less reliable than that of urban residents, military personnel, or religious officials. This meant that peasants had virtually no legal recourse when wronged by their social superiors, creating a system where exploitation was both legal and routine. Dress codes and sumptuary laws were designed to make peasant status immediately visible and to prevent any appearance of social mobility. Peasants were required to wear specific types of clothing, often in designated colors that marked their low status. They were prohibited from wearing silk, certain types of headgear, or jewelry that might suggest higher social rank. These restrictions weren't just about maintaining social order. They were about psychological humiliation and the constant reinforcement of peasant inferiority. Marriage restrictions created additional barriers to social mobility and cultural development. Peasants found it difficult to arrange marriages outside their immediate social class, and marriages between peasants and urban residents were heavily discouraged or prohibited outright. This geographic and social isolation prevented the development of broader kinship networks that might have provided economic opportunities or political protection. Educational opportunities for peasant children were virtually non-existent. The empire's educational system was designed to train religious scholars and government administrators, not to provide basic literacy or numeracy to rural populations. Most peasant children received no formal education whatsoever, ensuring that they remained trapped in the same social position as their parents. The few educational opportunities that did exist in rural areas were controlled by religious institutions that focused on rote memorization of religious texts rather than practical skills or critical thinking. Even this limited education was typically reserved for boys from families that could afford to spare their children's labor, excluding the vast majority of peasant children. Language policies reinforced social hierarchies by requiring peasants to conduct official business in languages they often didn't speak fluently. In many regions, peasants spoke local dialects or minority languages, but government business had to be conducted in Ottoman Turkish or Arabic. This language barrier made it difficult for peasants to understand their legal rights, navigate bureaucratic processes, or advocate for their interests. Cultural practices and traditions that might have provided peasants with dignity or autonomous identity were systematically suppressed or co-opted by the state. Traditional festivals, music, and storytelling were either banned outright or modified to reinforce Ottoman political and religious messages. This cultural suppression was designed to prevent the development of peasant consciousness that might challenge the existing social order. Religious practices among peasants were heavily regulated and monitored. While the empire allowed religious diversity, peasant religious activities were subject to close scrutiny and frequent interference. Religious leaders who might have advocated for peasant interests were often co-opted by the state or replaced with more compliant officials. The physical environment of peasant villages was kept deliberately primitive to reinforce social hierarchies. While cities featured impressive architecture, sophisticated infrastructure, and cultural amenities, peasant villages were characterized by simple mud brick houses, unpaved roads, and minimal public facilities. This environmental disparity was intended to make the superiority of urban civilization visually obvious and psychologically overwhelming. Social mobility was not just difficult for peasants, it was actively discouraged through both formal barriers and informal social pressure. Peasants who somehow acquired wealth or education faced intense scrutiny and often found themselves targets of increased taxation or harassment designed to force them back into their proper social position. The few peasants who did manage to improve their circumstances often found that success came at the cost of abandoning their communities and cultural identities. Social advancement typically required moving to cities, adopting urban customs, and severing ties with rural origins. This brain drain further weakened peasant communities by removing their most capable potential leaders. If life was brutal for peasant men, it was even worse for peasant women and children, who faced all the same hardships, plus additional layers of gender-based and age-based oppression. Ottoman peasant women lived lives of extraordinary hardship, with minimal legal rights and constant vulnerability to exploitation and abuse. Peasant women had virtually no legal status independent of their male relatives. They could not own property, conduct business transactions, or represent themselves in legal proceedings without male guardianship. This legal invisibility made them particularly vulnerable to abuse and exploitation, as they had no mechanisms for seeking justice or protecting their interests. The marriage system for peasant women was essentially a form of economic transaction between families, with the women themselves having no voice in the process. Parents arranged marriages based on economic considerations, often marrying off daughters as young as possible to reduce the economic burden on their families. These early marriages frequently resulted in dangerous pregnancies and high maternal mortality rates. Peasant women faced the double burden of agricultural labor and domestic responsibilities. During planting and harvest seasons, they worked in the fields alongside men while also maintaining households, preparing food, and caring for children. Their labor was essential to family survival, but was rarely recognized or compensated. The absence of medical care hit peasant women particularly hard. Childbirth was extremely dangerous, with maternal mortality rates approaching 20% in some regions. Women who survived multiple pregnancies often suffered from chronic health problems related to poor nutrition, excessive physical labor, and inadequate medical care. Life expectancy for peasant women was significantly lower than for urban women or peasant men. Domestic violence against peasant women was common and legally tolerated. Husbands had broad authority to discipline their wives, and community intervention in domestic disputes was rare. Women who fled abusive marriages faced destitution, as they had no economic resources or legal protections outside the marriage relationship. During times of economic hardship, peasant families often sold daughters into domestic slavery or arranged marriages that were essentially slavery contracts. Young women might be sent to work in urban households where they faced sexual exploitation, physical abuse, and dangerous working conditions with no legal protections or family support. The devshirme system, while focused on boys, also traumatized peasant mothers who had to watch their sons being taken away. The psychological trauma of losing children to the state created lasting mental health problems for many peasant women. Problems that were never acknowledged or treated by any social institutions. Peasant children faced their own unique hardships from the moment of birth. Infant mortality rates were extremely high, with perhaps 40 to 50% of children dying before their 5th birthday. Those who survived faced malnutrition, disease, and the early onset of adult responsibilities. Child labor was universal in peasant families. Children as young as 5 or 6 were expected to contribute to family survival through agricultural work, domestic tasks, or care of younger siblings. This early entry into the workforce prevented normal childhood development and often resulted in permanent physical damage from inappropriate labor. Education for peasant children was virtually non-existent, ensuring that they remained trapped in the same cycle of poverty and oppression as their parents. Even basic literacy was rare among peasant children, limiting their opportunities for social mobility or economic advancement. The few peasant children who showed exceptional ability or intelligence often became targets for exploitation rather than opportunities for advancement. Bright children might be sold to urban families as servants, or in the case of Christian boys, they became prime candidates for the devshirme system. Orphaned peasant children faced particularly harsh fates. With no social safety net and minimal community resources, orphans often became beggars, thieves, or child laborers. Some were sold into slavery or forced into dangerous occupations that adult workers wouldn't accept. The psychological development of peasant children was severely impacted by the constant violence and insecurity of their environment. Children who grew up witnessing domestic violence, military raids, and extreme poverty often developed lasting mental health problems that affected their ability to function as adults. The state of healthcare available to Ottoman peasants was so primitive and inadequate that it barely deserves the name healthcare at all. Peasant families faced disease, injury, and medical emergencies with virtually no professional medical support, relying instead on folk remedies, superstition, and prayer. The Ottoman Empire had sophisticated medical traditions and produced notable physicians and medical scholars. However, these medical resources were concentrated almost exclusively in major cities and served primarily wealthy urban populations. Rural areas, where the vast majority of peasants lived, were medical deserts with little or no access to trained physicians. The few medical practitioners available in rural areas were typically traditional healers with no formal training. While some of these folk healers possessed valuable knowledge about herbal remedies and basic medical procedures, others were charlatans who relied on superstition and harmful practices. Peasants had no way to distinguish between effective and dangerous treatments, and many died from diseases that could have been easily treated with proper medical knowledge. Infectious diseases were constant threats to peasant communities, and the lack of medical knowledge meant that epidemics often devastated entire villages. Simple diseases like dysentery, typhoid, or influenza could kill dozens of people in small communities that had no understanding of disease transmission or effective treatment methods. The absence of surgical capabilities meant that peasants who suffered serious injuries often died from conditions that would have been treatable in urban medical centers. A broken bone that became infected, a difficult childbirth, or a serious wound could become a death sentence for a peasant who had no access to surgical intervention. Mental health was completely ignored in peasant communities. People suffering from depression, anxiety, trauma, or other psychological conditions were often viewed as possessed by evil spirits or punished by God for their sins. The treatments for mental illness ranged from useless to actively harmful, including physical abuse, isolation, or dangerous religious rituals. Dental care was non-existent, leading to widespread tooth loss, abscesses, and oral infections that could spread throughout the body. Many peasants suffered chronic pain from dental problems that significantly impacted their quality of life and ability to work. Nutritional knowledge was limited, and peasant diets were often severely deficient in essential nutrients. This malnutrition weakened immune systems, stunted growth, and made peasants more susceptible to disease. Vitamin deficiency diseases like scurvy, rickets, and pellagra were common but not understood as preventable conditions. The lack of understanding about sanitation and hygiene contributed to the spread of diseases and parasites. Peasant villages often had contaminated water supplies, inadequate waste disposal, and housing conditions that facilitated the transmission of infectious diseases. Simple improvements in sanitation could have dramatically reduced disease rates, but this knowledge was not available to peasant communities. Pregnancy and childbirth were particularly dangerous for peasant women due to the combination of poor nutrition, hard physical labor, and lack of medical care. Many women died in childbirth from complications that could have been prevented or treated with proper medical intervention. Those who survived often suffered from lasting health problems related to difficult births. Occupational injuries were common due to the dangerous nature of agricultural work and the primitive tools available to peasants. Injuries from farm animals, farming implements, or heavy labor often resulted in permanent disabilities or death due to the lack of proper medical treatment. The absence of pharmaceutical knowledge meant that peasants had no access to effective medications for pain relief, infection control, or chronic disease management. Conditions that could have been managed with proper medication instead became sources of constant suffering or death. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the brutal exploitation of Ottoman peasants had created such severe problems that the entire imperial system began to collapse under its own contradictions. The very policies that had made the empire powerful in its early centuries eventually became the sources of weakness that led to its decline and eventual dissolution. The most fundamental problem was demographic decline in rural areas. Centuries of oppression, military conscription, disease, and economic exploitation had taken a severe toll on peasant populations. Birth rates declined as families struggled to survive, and death rates remained high due to poor living conditions and inadequate health care. Many rural areas that had once been densely populated and productive became depopulated wastelands. This demographic decline created a vicious cycle. As rural populations shrank, tax burdens on remaining peasants increased, making their lives even more difficult and encouraging further population decline through migration, mortality, or reduced fertility. Regions that had once been the backbone of Ottoman agriculture became economically marginal. The agricultural productivity that had once funded Ottoman expansion stagnated and then declined. The lack of investment in agricultural improvement, combined with environmental degradation and population decline, meant that many regions were producing less food than they had centuries earlier. This agricultural decline undermined the empire's ability to feed its cities and fund its military. The Timar system, which had been the foundation of Ottoman rural administration, became increasingly dysfunctional. As agricultural revenues declined, Timars became less valuable and less attractive to potential holders. Many Sipahis abandoned their rural responsibilities and moved to cities, leaving peasant communities without even the minimal protection and administration they had previously received. The tax farming system that gradually replaced direct government administration was even more exploitative than the Timar system. Tax farmers who purchased the right to collect taxes in specific regions had strong incentives to extract as much revenue as possible during their terms of office. This led to even more severe exploitation of peasant communities and further acceleration of rural decline. The empire's military effectiveness declined as its rural population base eroded. The Devshirme system became less effective as Christian populations declined in many regions. The quality of peasant conscripts declined as malnutrition and poor health became more widespread. Military campaigns became more expensive and less successful as the empire's human resources were depleted. Urban areas became increasingly dependent on food imports as domestic agricultural production declined. This made the empire vulnerable to blockades and trade disruptions, and it increased the cost of feeding urban populations. Cities that had once been supplied by surrounding rural areas now had to import food from distant regions or foreign countries. The government's fiscal situation deteriorated as rural tax revenues declined, while military and administrative expenses continued to grow. This led to currency debasement, inflation, and desperate attempts to squeeze more revenue from an already overexploited peasant population. These fiscal problems created political instability and undermined confidence in Ottoman institutions. Regional autonomy increased as central government control weakened. Local strongmen, bandit leaders, and autonomous governors filled the power vacuum left by declining central authority. While this sometimes provided better governance for specific regions, it also fragmented the empire and reduced its ability to coordinate responses to external threats. The empire became increasingly unable to compete with European powers that had developed more sustainable economic and political systems. While European countries were experiencing agricultural and industrial revolutions that increased their wealth and power, the Ottoman Empire was trapped in cycles of decline that made it increasingly vulnerable to external pressure. Social unrest increased as peasant communities reached the breaking point of what they could endure. Peasant rebellions, bandit activities, and regional conflicts became more frequent and more difficult for the central government to suppress. The empire that had once been known for its internal stability became plagued by chronic instability and violence. As we reach the end of this exploration into the brutal reality of peasant life in the Ottoman Empire, it's important to step back and consider what all of this suffering actually accomplished. The magnificent palaces of Istanbul, the impressive military campaigns, the cultural achievements that we associate with Ottoman civilization. All of this was built on the systematic exploitation of millions of peasant families who lived and died in misery. The Ottoman Empire is often remembered as one of history's great civilizations, and in many ways, this reputation is deserved. The empire made significant contributions to architecture, science, literature, and political organization. It created a system of government that managed incredible ethnic and religious diversity across 3 continents. It produced leaders, scholars, and artists whose achievements still inspire admiration today. But we must never forget that this imperial grandeur came at an enormous human cost. Every magnificent mosque was built with taxes extracted from starving peasants. Every successful military campaign was fought with soldiers conscripted from families that might never see their sons again. Every luxury enjoyed by the Ottoman elite was purchased with the suffering of rural populations who had no voice in how their wealth was used. The peasants whose stories we've told today weren't just statistics or historical abstractions. They were real people with hopes, dreams, families, and aspirations just like ours. They were parents who loved their children, farmers who took pride in good harvests, believers who found comfort in their faith despite systematic persecution. They were human beings who deserved better than the brutal exploitation they received from the system they supported with their labor and their lives. Their suffering wasn't inevitable or necessary for the empire's achievements. Other societies have created impressive civilizations without such extreme exploitation of their rural populations. The Ottoman system's brutality toward peasants wasn't a necessary evil. It was a choice made by rulers who prioritized imperial glory over human welfare. Perhaps most tragically, this exploitation was ultimately self-defeating. The very policies that extracted short-term wealth from peasant communities eventually destroyed the empire's foundation. By crushing rural productivity and devastating peasant populations, the Ottoman system undermined its own long-term sustainability. The empire that might have endured for centuries longer with more humane policies instead collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Today, as we enjoy freedoms and opportunities that Ottoman peasants could never have imagined, we owe it to their memory to remember their stories. We should be grateful for the social progress that has made such extreme exploitation less common in the modern world, while remaining vigilant against the systems and attitudes that could allow such exploitation to return. The story of Ottoman peasants is ultimately a reminder of the importance of human dignity and the dangers of systems that treat people as expendable resources rather than as valuable individuals. It's a call to ensure that our own societies are built on foundations of justice and opportunity rather than exploitation and oppression. And perhaps most importantly, it's a reminder that behind every historical statistic about taxation, military recruitment, or agricultural production, there were real human beings whose lives mattered just as much as ours do today. Their stories deserve to be told, their suffering deserves to be remembered, and their humanity deserves to be honored. The Ottoman Empire may have collapsed over a century ago, but the lessons from the experiences of its peasant populations remain relevant today. In a world where billions of people still face poverty, exploitation, and systematic oppression, the stories of Ottoman peasants remind us that we cannot separate human progress from human welfare. True civilization isn't measured by the grandeur of palaces or the success of military campaigns. It's measured by how a society treats its most vulnerable members. So the next time you read about the glorious Ottoman Empire in a history book, or see images of beautiful Ottoman architecture, remember the peasants whose labor and suffering made it all possible. Remember their names may be forgotten, but their humanity was real, their suffering mattered, and their stories deserve to be part of how we understand this complex and troubling period of human history. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to see more content exploring the human stories behind historical events. History isn't just about dates and battles, it's about real people whose experiences can teach us important lessons about how to build better societies today.